The notice was sitting on my front door when I got home from work, flapping in a bitter January wind that cut right through my coat like it had a personal grudge. I almost didn't read it right away because my fingers were already going numb just fumbling with my keys, and all I wanted was to get inside, pour a hot coffee, and forget that the temperature had dropped to single digits for the third day in a row. But something about the bright yellow paper caught my eye, the kind of aggressive color you use when you really want to ruin someone's evening, and I figured I'd better see what fresh nonsense had landed on my doorstep. Notice of violation, it said at the top, in bold letters that managed to feel smug even in print. Below that, in crisp, bureaucratic language that someone had clearly spent way too much time crafting. Resident Mark Wallace of 14 Birchwood Court is hereby notified that the use of an unauthorized electrical device plugged into the garage exterior outlet constitutes a violation of Pinecrest HOA Community Energy Conservation Policy. Section 4. Subsection C. Immediate removal of said device is required within 48 hours or a fine of $150 per day will be assessed. I stood there on my front steps in the freezing cold, reading this twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from hypothermia. The device in question, my heated car mat, a small 45-watt heated rubber mat I'd placed in the bed of my truck to keep it from freezing solid overnight so that when I needed to get to work at 6 in the morning, I wasn't spending 45 minutes with a heat gun trying to get the bed liner from turning into a block of ice. The outlet it was plugged into was inside my own garage, not some shared community outlet, not a neighbor's property, not a community-owned structure. My garage, my outlet, my truck, my heated mat. I went inside, poured that coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table. The wind outside was howling something serious, rattling the windows in their frames, and I could already hear the sound of my neighbor Dave scraping ice off his driveway with a metal shovel at 6 o'clock in the evening, because the sleet that had fallen earlier had frozen into a solid sheet of doom. This was the kind of winter where your car door handles snapped off if you pulled them too hard, where your windshield washer fluid froze in the nozzles, where you woke up to find a thin layer of ice had somehow gotten inside your mailbox. And someone had just handed me a violation notice for trying to keep my truck functional in these conditions. I knew exactly who had written it without even having to look at the signature at the bottom, but I looked anyway, and sure enough, there it was. Lorraine Nickerson, Pinecrest HOA Board of Directors, Energy and Property Standards Committee Chair. Lorraine Nickerson. Of course it was Lorraine Nickerson. She lived 3 houses down from me at 8 Birchwood Court, and she had been a thorn in the side of just about every homeowner on the street for the better part of 4 years. She was the kind of person who photographed your Christmas lights to measure whether they extended past the roofline in violation of the holiday decoration policy. She once wrote up a neighbor because his welcome mat was an unapproved color. She had argued at a board meeting for a full 20 minutes that the specific shade of green one homeowner had painted their mailbox post was not a compliant shade of green per the HOA's approved color palette. She was, in the politest possible terms, a nightmare wrapped in a North Face fleece and carrying a clipboard. The energy conservation policy she'd cited was something I had genuinely never heard of before this notice arrived, which immediately struck me as suspicious. I knew the HOA bylaws reasonably well because I'd had to look things up once or twice before when Lorraine had tried other stunts. So I dug my binder out of the cabinet where I keep important documents and flipped through it. The Pinecrest HOA Community Guidelines and Bylaws, last revised 18 months ago. I went through every single page. I found the noise ordinance, the landscaping rules, the fence height regulations, the rules about satellite dishes, the parking guidelines, and yes, there was an energy section. Section 4. I read through it carefully. Section 4 covered shared community energy resources. Things like not leaving community pool pumps running unnecessarily, not tampering with community irrigation systems, not using community electrical hookups for personal appliances at the gazebo or the park benches. That was it. The shared resources. Nothing in Section 4 said anything whatsoever about what a homeowner could or couldn't plug into their own garage outlet. There was no subsection C. Section 4 didn't even have a subsection C. It ended at subsection B, so Lorraine hadn't just stretched the rules. She had fabricated a rule that didn't exist. I took a long sip of my coffee, and I thought about this. The wind gusted outside, and somewhere down the street, I heard a car engine struggling to turn over in the cold. I thought about the 48-hour deadline. I thought about the $150 per day fine. I thought about how Lorraine had the authority to issue violation notices and fines as part of her committee role, and how the HOA had a mechanism to collect those fines that could, if left unpaid, get complicated in ways that most homeowners didn't want to deal with. I also thought about the fact that I was not most homeowners. I'm an IT project manager by profession, which means my entire job is documentation, process, evidence, and making absolutely sure that before I escalate anything, I have every single fact locked down so tightly that there's no room for interpretation. I am not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough contracts and compliance documents in my career to know when someone is making something up, and when they're trying to use institutional authority to bully someone who isn't going to push back. Lorraine was betting I wouldn't push back. She was very wrong. I started that same night. I photographed the violation notice. I made a copy of the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws, highlighting Section 4 in full and noting the absence of any subsection C that addressed private outlet usage. I pulled up the original HOA charter documents I'd received when I bought the house, which I'd also kept, and cross-referenced them. Nothing. There was no energy conservation policy that applied to private garage outlets. I documented my heated car mat, took photos of it, looked up the product specifications online, and printed them out. The mat was rated at 45 watts. For reference, a standard incandescent light bulb uses 60 watts. This was not exactly a power-hungry industrial heater. I also took photos of my garage outlet from multiple angles, showing clearly that it was interior to my garage, on my property, not connected to any shared community system. Then I wrote a formal response letter to the HOA board, addressed to the full board including Lorraine, formally disputing the violation notice on the grounds that the cited rule did not exist in the current bylaws, that the outlet in question was private property, and that I was requesting an immediate written clarification of exactly which rule I was alleged to have violated, with the specific language quoted verbatim. I sent it by email and by certified mail to the HOA's registered address, keeping copies of everything. The next morning was brutal. We'd gotten another 3 inches of snow overnight on top of the existing ice layer, and the roads were an absolute mess. The school district had called a 2-hour delay. My next-door neighbor Tom was out before 7 o'clock with a snowblower, and I could hear him working his way up and down his driveway in the gray pre-dawn light. I scraped my truck off, which took a solid 15 minutes, and then climbed in. The heated mat had done its job in the truck bed, keeping the liner from bonding to the metal the way it had been doing every night before I got it. Small victory, but I was taking every win I could get in this weather. I drove to work on roads that were technically plowed but still had a nice slick layer of packed snow, passing 3 cars that had slid off to the shoulder and 1 fender bender at the intersection of Birchwood and Elm. It was the kind of commute that made you wonder why you lived somewhere with real winters, and then you remembered the summers, and you forgave winter for about 30 seconds. At lunch, I checked my email. Lorraine had already responded, which surprised me because I'd expected her to take a few days to come up with something. Her response was not what I expected at all. Instead of backing down or clarifying the rule, she doubled down. She wrote that the Pinecrest HOA energy conservation policy had been updated and supplemented by board resolution in October, and that all residents had been notified, and that my failure to review the updated community standards does not exempt me from compliance. I read this 3 times. An October board resolution that updated the energy policy. That was news to me. HOA board resolutions that affected homeowner rights required notification per the state's HOA statutes. Our state had pretty clear rules about this. Any new rule or amendment adopted by the board had to be properly noticed to all homeowners, and there were specific requirements for how that notice had to be delivered. You couldn't just quietly pass a resolution at a board meeting and then spring it on people months later as the basis for a fine. I called my buddy Aaron, who is actually a licensed attorney and handles real estate and property law, though not as my formal attorney. I explained the situation. He laughed for about 20 seconds before composing himself, and then told me exactly what I suspected, which was that if this October resolution had not been properly noticed to homeowners per the state statute, it was unenforceable. He also told me that fabricating or improperly applying a rule to impose a fine could, under certain circumstances, cross into territory that wasn't just a civil matter. He didn't elaborate beyond that, but he told me to get a copy of the board meeting minutes from October and the documentation of how homeowners were supposedly notified. Under our state's HOA laws, homeowners had the right to request board meeting minutes and records. I sent another formal request that afternoon, certified mail and email, requesting the October board meeting minutes and all documentation of homeowner notification regarding the energy policy update. Lorraine took 4 days to respond to that one. 4 days during which the temperature outside barely crept above 15 degrees, the roads got plowed and then snowed on again, and a water main on the next street overfroze and burst, leaving about a dozen households without water for 2 days. January was being absolutely relentless that year. When Lorraine's response finally came, it was through the HOA's property management company, a company called Greenfield Community Management that handled the administrative side of things. A woman named Patricia from Greenfield emailed me to say that the October meeting minutes were available for review at the management office during business hours, but could not be emailed or copied due to pending legal review. Pending legal review. That was a new one. That phrase tends to mean one of 2 things. Either someone is actually consulting a lawyer about something legitimate, or someone is trying to stall because they know the documents are going to cause them problems. I took a half-day off work and went to Greenfield Community Management's office in person. I brought my camera. I brought a notepad. I brought my copies of the HOA bylaws. I also brought a copy of the state statute that specifically gave me the right to inspect and copy HOA records, which I had printed directly from the state legislature's official website. Patricia, to her credit, was actually pretty helpful once I put the statute in front of her. She looked a little uncomfortable about the whole thing, honestly. She let me into the records room and brought out the October board meeting minutes. I read them carefully and photographed every page. Here's what the October minutes showed. The board had met on October 14th. Lorraine had proposed an amendment to the energy conservation policy. The amendment as proposed was dense and vague, and basically said residents couldn't use hydroelectrical appliances in ways that affected community energy costs or aesthetics. There were some questions from other board members. The vote was 3-2 in favor of adopting it. Fine, boards can vote on things, but here's what the minutes also showed, or rather, what they failed to show. There was 0 documentation of how or when this amendment had been communicated to homeowners. There was no attached notice, no record of a mailing, no email blast documentation, nothing. I also noticed something else while I was flipping through the minutes. The vote had been 3-2, with Lorraine voting yes and casting what appeared to be the deciding vote. One of the other board members, A guy named Phil Hartman, who I knew slightly from neighborhood events, had actually written a dissenting note in the minutes that said the rule was overbroad and likely unenforceable as written. Phil's note was in the official record. Someone had tried to write it smaller than the rest of the text, but it was there. I photographed everything and went home feeling significantly better about my situation. That evening, I knocked on Phil Hartman's door. He lived on the other side of the neighborhood, 4 streets over. He came to the door in a heavy sweater with a cup of tea, looking like a man who had been expecting this visit. When I introduced myself and said I was the one who'd gotten the violation notice about the car mat, he actually sighed with what sounded like relief. Phil told me that the October vote had been contentious, that he'd objected specifically because the rule was vague and there was no clear notification plan, and that Lorraine had basically steamrolled the discussion. He said this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this, that there were 2 other homeowners who'd gotten similar notices under this same new rule that he'd never been shown, notices he hadn't known about until just now. He was visibly irritated. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through some emails, showing me a chain where he'd asked Lorraine for documentation of the homeowner notification, and she'd replied that it had been handled administratively without any specifics. Phil was on the board. He had standing. He told me he would formally request an emergency board meeting to address the issue, and that he'd do it in writing that same night. He was as done with Lorraine as I was. I got home, checked my own email, and found that one of the other homeowners who'd gotten a similar notice, a woman named Sandra Cho on Maple Drive, had somehow already found out about my dispute through the neighborhood Facebook group. Apparently someone had posted something vague about an HOA energy violation dispute, and Sandra had connected the dots. She messaged me asking if we could talk. Sandra and I ended up on the phone for about 40 minutes. Her violation was even more absurd than mine. She'd gotten a notice for using a space heater in her sunroom, which was an enclosed, permitted addition to her house, plugged into her own home's electrical system. Same fake rule, same citation to the non-existent subsection C, same $150 per day threat. She'd already paid a $300 fine because she hadn't wanted the hassle, and now she was furious. She'd paid money to Lorraine's HOA under a rule that didn't legally exist. Aaron, my attorney friend, when I called him that night and explained, got very quiet for a moment, and then said the words, "That's potentially extortion under color of authority," in a tone of voice that suggested he was no longer laughing. I want to be clear about something here. I'm not the type of person who goes looking for a fight. I would have been genuinely happy if Lorraine had just said, "You know what, I looked at the rules again and you're right, the car mat is fine, have a good winter." I would have said great, thanks, and gone back to my life. But Lorraine had collected money from Sandra under a fabricated rule, was threatening to collect money from me under the same fabricated rule, and had done so knowing that the rule hadn't been properly noticed to homeowners and arguably shouldn't have existed at all. That was a different category of problem. The next morning, Friday, Phil sent his formal written request for an emergency board meeting to all 5 board members and to Greenfield Community Management, copied to me and Sandra at our request. He cited specific concerns about the enforceability of the October amendment and the collection of fines under potentially invalid authority. He was polite but absolutely clear. Lorraine's response came within 2 hours, not to the board, to me personally by email. The subject line was "Request to resolve matter informally." In it, she suggested that if I simply removed the heated mat and paid a reduced fine of $75, she would consider the matter resolved and remove the violation from my record. She framed it as doing me a favor. I forwarded that email to Phil and Sandra immediately. Phil forwarded it to the rest of the board with a note that said something to the effect of, "This is exactly the problem." I also saved it with a timestamp, because this was now a document showing that Lorraine was personally negotiating fines outside of any official process, which was itself potentially another issue. Over that weekend, the neighborhood Facebook group became, let's say, lively. I hadn't posted anything personally, but Sandra had shared her situation, and then a third homeowner, a retired guy named Bob Kepler on the next street, mentioned that he'd gotten a similar notice 2 months ago for using an electric car charger in his own garage, and had paid the full $150 fine to avoid trouble. Bob was now considerably less philosophical about that decision. A fourth person, a young couple on the corner who I barely knew, messaged me privately to say they'd gotten an informal warning from Lorraine, not a full notice but a verbal warning, about leaving a plug-in air freshener running in their garage. They'd unplugged it to avoid problems. Lorraine had been running what amounted to a little neighborhood fine collection operation, and apparently this had been going on long enough that people had just been paying or complying to avoid the drama. By Sunday evening, there were 11 households in the neighborhood Facebook group who had either paid fines, received notices, or gotten warnings under this same energy rule. 11 households. At fines ranging from $75 to $300, Sandra had done some rough math in a comment and estimated the total collected could be anywhere from $500 to several $1,000s, possibly more. The question nobody had an answer to yet was where exactly that money had gone, because HOA fine revenue was supposed to go into the community fund, and the community fund was supposed to be accounted for in the annual financial report that every homeowner was entitled to see. I requested the financial records on Monday morning. Certified mail again, email again, citing the statute. Phil had already made the same request from the board side. He also escalated to Greenfield Community Management's regional director, a man named Charles Webb, explaining that there appeared to be a significant issue with how fine revenue had been collected and handled. Charles Webb apparently moved fast because by Tuesday afternoon I got a call from a woman at Greenfield who said they were conducting an internal audit of the Pinecrest HOA accounts effective immediately, and that all fine collection activity was suspended pending the audit results. She sounded like a person who had spent her Tuesday very differently than she'd planned. The emergency board meeting was set for Thursday evening, which was going to be interesting because another storm system was rolling in, and the forecast was calling for 8 to 10 inches starting Thursday afternoon. January was truly committed to making everything harder. Thursday arrived, and so did the storm, right on schedule. By the time the board meeting started at 7 o'clock that evening in the community room of the local library, which was where Pinecrest HOA held its meetings, the snow was coming down steadily, and the parking lot had about 3 inches of fresh accumulation. I drove over carefully, cleared the snow off my truck with the brush I keep behind the seat, and walked into the meeting to find it was standing room only. I had never in my life seen that many people at an HOA board meeting. There were at least 60 residents packed into a room that had maybe 40 chairs, with people standing along the walls and in the doorway. Someone had brought coffee, which was the smartest thing anyone had done all week. Sandra was there. Bob Kepler was there with his wife. Phil Hartman was at the board table looking like a man who had been waiting for this night for a while. The other 2 board members who'd voted against the October amendment were there too, looking cautious but interested. The 2 who'd voted with Lorraine were there, one of them clearly nervous, the other one doing a good impression of someone who was seriously considering becoming invisible. Lorraine walked in 3 minutes before the meeting started, wearing her North Face and carrying her clipboard, and the room temperature dropped about 10 degrees that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She sat down at the board table without making eye contact with anyone, which was telling because Lorraine was normally the type who made a lot of eye contact in a pointed and deliberate way. Phil opened the meeting and immediately moved to address the core issues. He laid it out calmly and systematically. The October amendment, the notification problem, the fine collection, the financial questions. He was methodical and fair, not attacking anyone personally but making the facts very clear. When it came time for Lorraine to respond, she said the notifications had been handled through the community newsletter. There was a murmur in the room. Phil asked which specific issue of the newsletter and what date. Lorraine said October, the regular monthly newsletter. Phil said he'd looked at the October newsletter and it did not contain any mention of the energy policy amendment. He had a copy. He held it up. Lorraine said there had been an insert, a supplemental insert. Phil said he had the original mailing from Greenfield, and there was no record of an insert being printed or mailed with the October newsletter. He had a letter from Charles Webb at Greenfield, confirming that no supplemental insert had been produced or distributed. He also held that up. The room was very quiet except for the wind outside and the sound of snow hitting the windows. Lorraine said the newsletter was distributed electronically as well, and the amendment had been in the email version. Phil said he'd checked with Greenfield and the email newsletter for October had been sent to the distribution list, and he had a copy of that email, and it also did not contain the amendment. He had a printout of the email. Lorraine sat back in her chair. Her clipboard was on the table in front of her, and she wasn't touching it anymore. Phil then brought up the financial question. He said the HOA financial records for the period covering October through January needed to be reviewed by the full board and by Greenfield, and that the fine revenue collected during that period needed to be accounted for and confirmed to have been deposited into the community fund. He said the board was voting to initiate an immediate audit. The vote was 4-1. Lorraine was the one. After the meeting, which lasted almost 2 hours partly because so many residents wanted to speak, and partly because the board was making motions and taking votes on several housekeeping matters that Phil had clearly prepared in advance. A small group of us stayed in the parking lot despite the snow and the cold. The storm had picked up during the meeting, and there was easily 6 inches on the ground now, with more coming. We stood under the overhang of the library entrance, breath fogging, stomping our feet to keep warm, and talked. Bob Kepler said his brother-in-law was an attorney and he'd already spoken with him. Sandra said she'd documented everything and had a total of $300 in fines she'd paid under the invalid rule. One of the other residents, a man named Greg who I hadn't met before, said he'd paid 2 fines totaling $450 and was similarly interested in getting that money back. The topic of where exactly the fine money had gone, given that Greenfield had no record of it being deposited in a normal way, was making everyone increasingly uncomfortable in a way that went beyond HOA annoyance into something more serious. I drove home carefully in the snow, 4-wheel drive engaged, watching the road ahead. A snowplow went by on the main road, its yellow lights flashing through the falling white, pushing a wall of snow to the shoulder. I got home, pulled into my garage, and yes, plugged my heated car mat back in, because frankly I was going to need my truck functional the next morning and nobody had the legal authority to stop me. The Greenfield audit, which Charles Webb had moved on quickly, came back with results 2 weeks later. January had finally, grudgingly, given way to early February, which was marginally less brutal but still very much committed to the bit. The audit results were not good for Lorraine. Over a period of 6 months, fine revenue totaling approximately $4,200 had been collected from various Pinecrest HOA residents under the energy policy rule. Of that amount, approximately $1,800 had been properly deposited into the HOA community fund account. The remaining $2,400 had not been deposited. There were records of the fines being collected, because Greenfield processed the payments, but the disbursement to the community account was incomplete in a way that the audit report described, very carefully, as irregular and not consistent with standard HOA financial procedures. Greenfield immediately escalated to their legal team and flagged the situation for potential financial misconduct. They also notified the board in writing, and because of the dollar amount and the pattern, they notified local authorities. When I say local authorities, I mean the police. Specifically, the Financial Crimes Division of the County Sheriff's Office, which handles fraud, embezzlement, and related matters. Lorraine was contacted by investigators on a Wednesday. The same day I got a call from Phil Hartman giving me a heads up that things were escalating in a serious direction. I wasn't directly involved in the investigation, obviously, but Phil kept me informed because I was one of the people who had originally flagged the problem. He told me that Lorraine had initially insisted she had proper documentation for everything, that the money had been reallocated for community improvements, she had personally approved, and that she had authority to do so. She did not have authority to do so. The HOA bylaws were extremely clear on this. Fine revenue went to the community fund, period, and any expenditure from the fund required board approval with a vote. There was no record of any board vote authorizing Lorraine to redirect fine revenue to anything. The community improvements she claimed to have funded turned out to be, when investigators looked into it, somewhat hard to identify. There was a receipt for some landscaping work at the entrance to the neighborhood, and there was a receipt for some equipment, but the amounts didn't reconcile with the missing money in a way that explained the full discrepancy. The investigation took about 6 weeks in total, which is actually pretty fast for this kind of thing. And at the end of it, Lorraine Nickerson was charged with misappropriation of HOA funds, a Class D felony under our state statutes covering nonprofit and community organization financial fraud. It covered the amount she diverted from the community account for purposes not authorized by the board. She was arraigned, pled not guilty initially, and was released pending trial. While all of that was happening, the HOA situation was being cleaned up in parallel. Phil Hartman, working with the other 3 board members who were solidly on the right side of this, formally rescinded the October Energy Policy Amendment on the grounds that it had not been properly noticed to homeowners, and that the board lacked authority to impose fines under an unnoticed rule. They put a formal written notice of rescission in the February newsletter, in the email newsletter, and mailed hard copies to every address on the community list, which was how it was supposed to have been done in the first place. They also sent formal refund notices to every homeowner who had paid fines under the invalid energy rule. That process took a few weeks to work through Greenfield systems, but checks went out in February and March. Sandra got her $300 back. Bob Kepler got his $150 back. Greg got his $450 back. I hadn't paid anything, so there was nothing to refund me, but I got a formal written acknowledgement that my violation notice had been invalid and was expunged from my record, which I kept in my binder because at this point I was maintaining a very thorough binder. The board also rewrote the community notification procedures with Phil's guidance, adding specific requirements for how rule changes had to be communicated, deadlines for distribution, and a confirmation process through Greenfield, so there was a paper trail. It wasn't exciting governance, but it was exactly the kind of boring, important infrastructure that prevented this kind of thing from happening again. Lorraine's case went to trial in the spring, by which point the snow had finally retreated and the neighborhood was starting to look like itself again, with people out walking dogs and kids riding bikes, and all the normal sounds of a neighborhood that had been cooped up too long finally getting some fresh air. She ended up taking a plea deal about 3 weeks into the trial process, pleading guilty to a reduced charge of financial mismanagement in exchange for a suspended sentence, full restitution of the misappropriated funds, and permanent removal from any HOA or community organization governance role as a condition of her probation. The restitution went back into the Pinecrest HOA Community Fund where it belonged. She resigned from the board, obviously. She was required to as part of the deal. I heard later, through the neighborhood grapevine, which had become remarkably efficient over the course of all this, that Lorraine had also been told by her attorney to keep a very low profile in the community going forward. Whether she took that advice or not wasn't really my concern. She was still in her house down the street, and occasionally our paths crossed in that way that happens in small neighborhoods, but there was no longer any clipboard, no more brightly colored violation notices on front doors, no more invented rules about what you could plug into your own garage outlet. The community came out of the whole experience with something genuinely useful, which was a renewed interest in actually paying attention to HOA governance. The next board meeting, after everything settled down, had almost 30 residents in attendance, which was apparently about 3 times the normal turnout. People were running for the open board seats that were coming up at the annual election. Phil Hartman was nominated to be board president and accepted, and his candidacy was unopposed. Sandra Cho ran for the Energy and Property Standards Committee chair position, specifically so she could be the person who made sure energy policy was rational and legally grounded, and she won easily. Bob Kepler's brother-in-law drafted a set of homeowner rights guidelines that the board adopted, summarizing residents' rights regarding violations, fines, appeals, and record access in plain language that didn't require you to dig through state statutes to understand. They posted it on the HOA website, which also got a redesign because apparently the old one hadn't been updated since the early 2010s and nobody could find anything on it. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had been somewhat chaotic during the peak of the drama, settled back down into its usual rhythm of lost cat alerts, recommendations for snow removal services, and debates about whether the entrance landscaping should include more evergreens. Normal stuff. Good stuff. My truck got through the rest of winter without incident, the heated mat doing exactly what it was designed to do every night, keeping things from turning into a frozen mess so I could get to work in the mornings without the kind of extended defrosting ritual that you really don't want to be doing when the temperature is still in the teens and you have a 7 o'clock meeting. It was a 45-watt device plugged into my own outlet on my own property, and I want to reiterate how profoundly unremarkable that is as a thing to do in winter. It was funny, looking back on it. The whole thing had started with a piece of yellow paper on my front door on a bitter January night, flapping in the wind, and it had ended with a woman being charged with a felony, a community getting its money back, and a neighborhood that was more engaged in its own governance than it had been in years. I hadn't gone looking for any of it. I just wanted my truck to start in the morning. But I think what made the whole thing unfold the way it did was the documentation. Every step of the way, I wrote things down, made copies, sent certified letters, kept timestamps. When Lorraine sent that informal email suggesting I pay a reduced fine to make it go away, I saved it. When I found the board meeting minutes with Phil's dissenting note, I photographed every page. When Greenfield gave me access to records, I documented what I saw. I treated the whole thing the way I'd treat a project at work. Gather the facts first, build the case, then act. There's a version of this story where I just unplug the mat, pay the fine, grumble about it for a week, and move on. Lorraine keeps doing what she's been doing. The other homeowners keep paying. The money keeps going wherever it was going. Nothing changes. I thought about that version, honestly, in those first couple of days. The HOA has a way of making the path of least resistance very appealing because the alternative seems exhausting and uncertain. But the path of least resistance was how Lorraine had built up years of this behavior in the first place. People kept paying because fighting seemed harder. And so she kept escalating, got bolder, invented rules, collected money she wasn't entitled to collect, and started redirecting funds that belonged to the community. The longer it went on, the bigger the problem grew. The only reason it stopped was because someone finally said no and meant it. Phil came over one evening in early March when the last of the snow was melting, and the gutters were running with cold water, bringing a 6-pack of beer as a thank you for getting the ball rolling. We sat in the garage, which was actually pretty comfortable with the door cracked and the spring air starting to smell like mud and thaw, and talked for a while about the neighborhood and the HOA, and what the next few years might look like now that the board had some more sensible people on it. He told me that even before the October amendment situation, there had been concerns about Lorraine's management of the committee, that she'd been issuing informal warnings and conducting what Phil called drive-by inspections of properties without any formal process. Other board members had raised concerns, but hadn't had enough support to do anything about it. The October vote had been close for a reason. Phil had seen this coming for a while and hadn't been able to stop it through normal channels, which was frustrating to him. But sometimes that's how it goes. Sometimes the wrong person wins a close vote and it takes a bigger situation to correct it. I told him about the night I'd first read the notice, standing on my front steps in single-digit temperatures, fingers going numb, reading about my car mat violating energy policy. He laughed. We both laughed, because in hindsight it was genuinely absurd, a 45-watt rubber mat becoming the thread that unraveled months of questionable HOA governance. But that's often how it works. The thing that finally breaks a pattern isn't always the biggest or most dramatic thing. Sometimes it's just a thing that happens to land on the wrong person's doorstep. Sandra organized a neighborhood cookout in late spring when the weather finally committed to being civilized. Not a big formal thing, just a block party kind of deal, people bringing food, kids running around. That first real warm Saturday that feels like a reward after a long winter. I went over and brought potato salad and ended up in conversation with people I'd barely met before all this started, including that young couple on the corner who'd gotten the verbal warning about their air freshener. They were a couple years out of college, new homeowners, and they told me that the whole experience had made them realize they needed to actually read their HOA documents and understand what their rights were, because they'd had no idea. That felt like the most genuinely useful thing to come out of all of it. Not the refunds, not the legal accountability, not even Lorraine's removal from the board, though all of those things mattered. It was the fact that 60 people had shown up to a meeting in a snowstorm, and the neighborhood Facebook group had more substantive discussions in those 2 months than it had in the previous 2 years, and people started treating HOA governance as something that actually affected their lives and deserved attention. Because it does. It affects what you can do on your own property, what your home is worth, how community funds are managed, and how you're treated by people who have been given a small amount of authority and either use it responsibly or don't. Lorraine had used it irresponsibly, and the community had corrected that. I replaced the heated car mat in late fall, getting a new model that was slightly better insulated. Filed it away as a practical winter purchase, the kind of thing you don't think about until the temperature drops and you're glad you have it. Plugged it into the garage outlet same as before. Didn't worry about it. Nobody said a word. The violation notice I still have in my binder, behind the section with the HOA bylaws and Phil's contact information, and the state statute on HOA record access. I keep it partly as a reminder and partly because it still makes me laugh a little, reading that officious language about unauthorized electrical devices, and immediate compliance required for a thing that uses less electricity than a light bulb. Sometimes on cold winter mornings, when I'm scraping frost off the windshield, and my truck starts on the first try, and the heated mat has done its quiet, boring, completely legal job overnight, I think about Lorraine Nickerson and her clipboard and her color-coded violation notices, and the small empire of petty authority she'd been building one fabricated rule at a time. And I think about what it cost her and what the community got back, and how differently it all could have gone if everyone had just kept paying and complying and staying quiet. Don't stay quiet. Read your bylaws, keep your receipts, know your rights, send certified mail. And if somebody tells you your 45-watt car mat plugged into your own garage outlet is a violation of energy policy, ask them to show you exactly where it says that. In writing, cited specifically, with the exact rule language quoted verbatim, because if they can't do that, you've already won. You just have to be willing to see it through. The winter eventually ended, the way all winters do, grudgingly and slowly, with a few last gasps of cold and a couple of late-season snowfalls that everyone was thoroughly done with by the time they arrived. The crocuses came up along my front walk in March, purple and white against the last of the gray slush. The neighborhood settled into spring, quieter and, I think, genuinely better than it had been going into that long, cold season. And down at 8 Birchwood Court, the lights were on and a car sat in the driveway like any other house on the street. No clipboard visible through the windows. No yellow paper flapping in the wind. Just a house on a street in a neighborhood that had figured out, one frozen January at a time, how to take care of itself.